Welcome to session 11 of our study of Mark's Gospel, the Journey of Jesus. I'm glad that you've joined us, especially if it's your first time with us today. Once again, I want to remind you to please go down into the description below this video in our YouTube channel. And in that description, you'll find a link to the student guide for today's lesson. And please do the pre-video work. I had a person who's been studying this along with us who told me how valuable that pre-class work is. Today begins a two-part study. Sessions 11 and 12 are really connected to each other, and they hinge on the story of Jesus calling the 12 apostles. And you'll see that as we go through. We'll look at that calling of the 12 apostles in today's lesson. So before we get into the text, I did learn something from one of the commentators that I found rather interesting today. I've taught on Mark's Gospel a number of times. I've studied it a number of times, but you always learn something new, right? And this commentator talked about the difference between Matthew's Gospel and Mark's Gospel. I think I've mentioned this before, but Matthew's Gospel is organized around 5 sermons of Jesus. The most prominent of those is the Sermon on the Mount. The narratives or stories that Matthew includes in his gospel support those 5 teachings. The stories that Matthew tells then are kind of like looking at a photo album. You open up a family photo album and you see the picture of a point in time, right? And you remember the story, but that happened at a certain time. Mark's gospel is much more like a movie. That there's not the emphasis on the teachings, but the stories, the narratives that Matthew tells, and the way he tells them is we're moving forward. Let me give you an example of that. Matthew might say something like this: Jesus went to Galilee, where Mark would say it this way: Jesus was going to Galilee. It both means the same thing, but they communicate something different. One has this point in time kind of action. It was a snapshot. The other is a movie as he's going. We're following Jesus. And the reason why I bring this up is because as I teach these lessons on Mark's Gospel, I want to be true to how the Holy Spirit inspired Mark to write the Gospel. And I pray that I'm doing that for you. And maybe that gives you some insight into the difference between at least Matthew and Mark. We need to go back and remember where we were. From the beginning of chapter 2 into verse 6 of chapter 3, Jesus has predominantly been in controversy with the religious leaders. Now, there was a story about fasting in there, which wasn't really about controversy. But there's this escalating controversy that takes place to the point that in 3:6, for the first time, the religious leaders plot to kill Jesus. And so it shouldn't surprise us that the first thing that Mark tells us about Jesus in verse 7 is that he withdrew to the Sea of Galilee. This will be his second journey to the Sea of Galilee. The first time was when he called Levi to follow him. And now he withdraws to the Sea of Galilee. He gets away from Capernaum for the second time. The word withdrew is only used by Mark one time in his gospel, and that's here. It has the connotation of an army withdrawing. And those of you who have been in the military and have served and maybe have been in battles know how important it is at times. You got to pull back so you can resupply and you can rest and you can be ready for the battle coming. And that's for Jesus too. He needed to withdraw to re-energize. But there's an issue that comes with that for Jesus as well. Right? In the same verse, Mark tells us that a large multitude of people came to him. And did you notice how after he identifies where these people are coming from, once again he has to tell us it was a large multitude. He bookends where they've come from with this comment that it was a large multitude. He gives us much more detail than any of the other gospel writers do. And when you look at it, you begin to realize that this crowd comes from every place in Palestine, from north and south and east and west. Remember this, Jesus has only been in Galilee so far in Mark's gospel. And yet his report is spreading everywhere. It's going out everywhere. among the Jews predominantly, but not just the Jews, the Gentiles. Tyre and Sidon, cities on the coast, were predominantly Gentiles, and Gentiles, we believe, were coming to Jesus as well. Now, Jesus tells his disciples to prepare a boat, to get a boat ready for him, not to sail in it, but to get it ready for him to be put out from the sea probably, and so that he might teach. Even though the text doesn't say that, it's kind of assumed that that's what's happening. And why would he need to have a boat? Why couldn't he just teach him from the shore? Because Mark tells us this large crowd was crushing Jesus. You had people who wanted to touch him so that they could be healed of what was beating them up. The word there is being whipped, being scourged, and that's the way they felt about their diseases, their illnesses. They were being scourged by these things, and they simply wanted to touch Jesus. And then there's the demonics coming. And when the demons would see Jesus, they'd fall on the ground and they would declare that he was the Son of God. Let's not skip over this idea that they fell down before him. You see, both in word and in action, they were proclaiming Jesus to be the Son of God. By falling down, they weren't worshiping him, but they were acknowledging who he was. And then you have Jesus healing many of them. It's interesting because Matthew says he healed all of them. I don't want to make too much of that. It's just one of those kind of interesting differences between the two Gospels. What's interesting next, in the break, there's no transition for us. There's no transition for us to get from the Sea of Galilee to this mountain, whatever mountain it was, when Jesus calls his disciples. But Mark right away takes us to the top of a mountain. And he says something the other two gospel writers do not say. He says that he called those whom he desired, those whom he wanted. Out of all the disciples that were following him at this time, others that he may have personally called like he did, Peter and Andrew, James and John and Levi, he picks 12, whom he desired. Now, I wonder if you caught this. Did you catch something kind of interesting in the listing of the 12 apostles? The first 3 Jesus gives a name to, not the other 9. Peter, he calls Simon. James and John, he calls sons of thunder. But he doesn't give names to the other 9 disciples. He might say who they were related to, who was their dad. But he doesn't say anything about giving them a name. And you begin to wonder, is Mark doing that to tell us that these three are special inner core disciples of Jesus? There's the chosen and there's the really chosen to be a part of his disciples, his people. But then we want to talk about Judas for a second, Judas Iscariot. Let's imagine this is the first time that you have read Mark's gospel. You don't know Jesus' story. You've never heard it before. This is your introduction to Jesus. And right away, beginning of his gospel, you hear about one of his disciples, and he's betraying Jesus. Strike you kind of odd? I mean, isn't that a way a good story is told? He doesn't give us the details. He doesn't tell us how it's going to happen, when it's going to happen, how it's going to end. But at this point in the story, we're going to keep our eye out for Judas. And we're going to see how he betrays Jesus and what that means for Jesus. So anyway, as we like to do with these lessons, I want you to have 3 takeaways here. Takeaway number 1. If Jesus needed to withdraw from the battles to refresh his spirit, we also need times where we withdraw from our daily battles. That's the whole point of the Sabbath. Remember, we talked about the Sabbath in the last 2 sessions. The point of the Sabbath is a point of withdrawal, a point for us to get away from the battles, because they're raging around us too. Second takeaway, Jesus still wants us to seek him because of what he did. He wants us to go back into scriptures and see all the things he did and also what he does today. And he wants us to seek him because of those things, to seek him out like the people did in our text. And then thirdly, your third takeaway, Jesus has called us to be his disciples because he desires for us to be with him. Let me read that one more time. Jesus has called us to be his disciples because he desires for us to be with him. He desires you to be with him. Now, we're not one of the 12, I get that, but he still calls us. In the waters of baptism, he still desires us. He desires you. Okay, that's a lot there in this study. So it's your turn now. Go to your student guide, answer the questions, and I pray God's blessings as you continue your study.